Welcome to today's event on getting to the root of data at your organization. And we'll be hearing from the Wildlife Trust, which is very exciting. We're lucky to have Alice and Ian here, and I'll tell you a bit more about them a little later. I'm Nish. I am the Data Collective Community Manager. And as I said a little earlier, but I'd just like to reiterate, if you have any access needs or need any support during this call, please feel free to message me confidentially and I'll be happy to help. While we're in the session, you are more than welcome. So the structure of the session is a webinar format. So you're more than welcome to use the chat to ask any questions. And also specifically for the section around asking the panelists questions, we request that you use the Q&A option to ask the questions, and the chat will be basically for you to connect, meet other people, share information. Just feel free to use it in that kind of way rather than in a way of asking questions to the panelists. So just to kind of start off, what is the Data Collective? So the purpose of the community, the Data Collective, is to help charities and other civil society organizations to access and analyze data better in order to increase their impact. This space exists to foster connections between people who may be facing similar data challenges, to share good practice, and to help organizations to share their data with other organizations. We have a mailing list, a Slack channel. We offer these webinars, and we also offer workshops. So the space is not just for data practitioners or analysts, but also for other people in the social sector, including senior leaders, to discuss topics like this one, which hopefully will be very informative for all of you. For today's session, we're going to have two 20-minute talks by our speakers, and then that will be followed by a question and answer section. The question and answer section is not recorded, but the rest of it is, and we put that up on YouTube so you can access it later as well. Yeah, so please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A option at any point during this call. To kind of say who's speaking, so we have two lovely speakers today from the Wildlife Trust, and they'll be sharing their experience of all things data in the organization. We'll have Alice Kershaw go first, and then we'll be followed by Ian Jackson. Alice has been with the Wildlife Trust for nearly 2 years, leading the root and branch digital transformation elements of their 2030 strategy. She is a specialist in change, transformation, and creating a digital culture which benefits all users. She has worked in a variety of third sector organizations, including small and medium-sized charities, national funders, and development organizations. She is qualified in process engineering and business analytics and experienced in building and developing products using agile methodologies. Welcome, Alice.
Hey, nice to be here. And that made me sound very exciting. So I'm sure you all cannot wait to hear about me. Thanks very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen now so I can talk to you a little bit about data at the Wildlife Trusts. So let me just share my screen. I'm just going to make sure it's on the right thing, as with all technology. Right, here we go. Let's share that. I'm just going to stick it into the actual PowerPoint mode. Nish, could you stick your thumb up if you can see this? Because I can see you. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about data at the Wildlife Trust. You've heard who I am on a professional level, just because we're all human beings and sometimes technology makes us feel like that's not quite the case. Here is a picture of me taking 30 days wild very seriously by being outside for a whole week in June doing the spine race this year. So just to show I don't spend all my time inside mapping processes, although I do that too. I am a digital professional, but I've also worked in a variety of different organisations. And specifically here, I support the Wildlife Trust Federation with making the most of digital. How do we make the most of digital for nature? So some of that involves being out in it. Anyway, I just want to say a bit more about who I am from a more human side of it. Anyway, spoilers. First, spoilers. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm sure, hopefully, you will get something out of this. We're not there yet. I'm not going to come in here and say we have smashed it, we've solved it, data. Oh, you know what? We've really got it. We haven't. We're not there yet. It is definitely a journey. So I want to put that right up front to manage your expectations. Please don't leave. We still have stuff we can share, but I just wanted to tell you that right at the start. So What's the Wildlife Trust Federation? What are we? I just used that phrase. What does it actually mean? Some of you may know a bit about the Wildlife Trust because we have 46 wildlife trusts that cover everywhere in the UK and some of the kind of crown dependencies as well. So there will be a wildlife trust that covers your area. We are a grassroots organisation, which means that we are everywhere and we're very locally focused and we know a lot about our local areas. And that's the big strength of what the Wildlife Trust does. We're a bit like a murmuration. We are all individual birds and it's very fiercely independent individual birds, but we flock together, we make good shapes and we have a shared strategy. And that's really important for what we're trying to do to bring nature back. So our strategy takes us up to 2030 and it is ambitious because it has to be. But why should we care about data? Why is that something to do with it? Surely we should be out, on reserves, buying land, managing things, releasing beavers. That's what we should be doing. Why are we talking about data? Well, it's an absolutely critical part of our strategy. So our strategy for 2030 is made up of 3 strategic goals, 5 strategic transformations and 5 enabling priorities. And one of our strategic transformations, and the one that I support the Wildlife Trust Federation with, is undergoing a root and branch digital transformation. Now, I love this one because it's an ecological metaphor. I think that's the best one of all of our strategy descriptions. Anyway, but basically, we're looking to do a number of things that makes digital work for us as an organisation. I'm not going to read all of this, you'll be glad to know, but you can find it online. We're basically trying to embrace a digital culture. We're looking at kind of 3 really key things that are going to support us in our journey to delivering our 2030 strategy. One of them is being more aware of digital, so making sure that we have digital technology in our strategies, digital ways of working, digital processes. We are fit for purpose for the modern age and we're inclusive, accessible, secure, all these things we need at a foundational level for digital to start to work. We're also wanting to be skilled about it. We need to have the skills in order to learn how to work in a digital world. But critically for today, we also say we want to be more informed. So we've said in our strategy, insights and analysis from digital technologies and innovations are enabling and streamlining strategic and operational decision making. Now that sounds a bit jargony, but what does that mean? Well, looking at our direction of travel here, we are going from what's described as inconsistent data to data informing our decisions. It should be underpinning what we are doing. It's too important to mess this stuff up. We need to make sure that we are making an impact and that it's working. We need the data to know where we should be working, what actions people are taking for nature, seeing if things are working for us. We need data on species. We need data on habitats. We need data on people and what they're doing. It covers everything. We're also local, but how do we make national impact? So there's a whole series of things that make data absolutely critical to what we're trying to do, but also makes it quite complicated because bear in mind that 46 different organisations have at least 46 different ways of storing their data, different ways of presenting their data, different systems, different ways of using it, different processes, different approaches. So how do we make sure that we get that scale of impact and understanding with what we're trying to do? So where do we even start? I've just described a little bit about where we are, which is lots of data everywhere. It's really critical. It's really important. We have loads. Some bits we maybe don't have and we should have. Where do we begin with this? And as this is one of my favorite quotes from William Gibson, which is the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So first things first, great, we're in a federation. That means we have 46 different groups of people trying to solve problems, which leads to some great innovation. So let's have a look at what is actually working. We have some really interesting stuff out there where data is already being used and utilized in tools. We have some really interesting digital approaches. Great, that's a good place to start. Let's have a little look at what's going on. This is just some examples. There is some amazing stuff going on across the Wildlife Trust Federation, from scanning things from space in Surrey on Space for Nature through to, there's a little clip here of Beaver Map, which is one of Derbyshire's find out where the beavers are in Willington Wetlands map. We've got Nature Counts, which was developed in Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust. We've got all kinds of drones going on in Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. So we've got lots of stuff here that we can start to look at. And this is definitely a huge advantage of being a federation, is that having a bit of a scan of where are things really interesting, where are things going on. Great. So there's some things we can start to look at. These are the things that are often, though, quite shiny and quite exciting, but it's not going to necessarily help us get collectively to where we want to be. So these things are brilliant. We can learn from them. We can scale from them. They're great. But where do we want to get to? we've been working with what's called the Digital Transformation Delivery Group. We have two. We have an advisory group, of which Ian is one of our very valued members. And we have a delivery group, which is people who are working to do digital transformation across the Wildlife Trust Federation. Highly recommend doing something like that. If you have a way to bring people together who are working on this similar thing without being prescriptive about it, really helps. So we've been looking at where do we trying to get to? What's our maturity level? And so we've developed this kind of very outline idea of we want to get from a kind of area where we have all the foundations in place, which all wildlife trusts should be able to get to. And you'll see on the bottom there, we have insights and analysis. That is a really critical part of foundationally being able to get to where we want to get to. And then we want to be able to work up. So some people might want to be pioneers, in which case they should be helping others along the journey. But some might not want to get that far. They don't need to get that far. They only want to be pioneering in certain areas. So we've started to think about how do we get to this point? How do we know where we want to get to? Because once again, spoilers, digital transformation, data transformation is not going to be done. We're not going to get to a point where we go, you know what, that's finished. We want to have a kind of living structure of what we're working through. So all that to say, this was our nice idea of, okay, yep, seems to make sense. We all want to get to foundations and then see if we want to work up. Except we've got a long way to go. So with our advisory group, we've been looking at what our key priorities are against the strategy. And this is a bit of spoilers for Ian, and he will talk about this more because we definitely learned a lot from OneGeology and the expertise of those on that advisory group to start to look at where did we really need to get to with our data. We know it's out there. We know we want to have, which says here, making data work for people and nature is the kind of tagline. We wanted to use applied data and insight. So we needed to kind of get back to basics. What data do we have? How do we use it? How do we make sure that data is understood as something that's valued? How do we show people what we have? And how do we share it with anyone? And how do we make sure people can find it? So there were some key questions we needed to start thinking about, because you can start off by kind of going, you know what? We just need to bring it together. Data infrastructure, get some really good techie bits in there, data lake, data warehouse, those kind of things would be great. Data fabric, data bricks. If you Google it, there's 4,000 different ways you can bring your data together. We could start there. That's not going to be where we're going to start. We need to start by looking much more fundamentally at these questions of kind of what do we hold, why do we hold it, what do we need? But also, how do we make sure that that's supported by a data first kind of data valuing culture? And that's a real challenge as well, because we want to make sure that people understand the value of it. We own and manage that data. It's really critical. But how do we make sure we get that right as well? So this is one of the workshop slides from a workshop with the advisory group to work backwards through quite a number of different bits against our transformation 4, which is root and branch digital transformation priorities. So we've been collectively working on this. This isn't, I don't come up with this. It is absolutely across the Federation. We work on what we want to do together. And that, I'm just going to show you, it's not just a series of horrible Miro boards, don't worry, this is the last one of those. But basically, we have all come together against every single goal, transformation and enabling priority to actually look at where we want to get to between now and 2030. And we've backcasted it, which is starting 2030 with the kind of absolute vision of where we want to get to, and work backwards to what does that practically mean. Now, I've color coded this version of our backcast. It was a lot of post-it notes on walls, I can tell you that. But I've color coded it. So red, kind of the reddy pink color that's on here is effectively relies entirely on some kind of digital technology. And the orange version means that something like data flows is critical for it. So data and digital runs through our strategy like a stick of rock. So it's quite important that we start to think about this. And it's also important that we know that that's the case, like actually identifying where within our strategy is data going to play a critical role, so we can work out what do we need to be doing now to make sure that it's there and working for us in 2026, 28, whatever it is when we get to the point we need it. So we needed some help. We needed to work with some people in order to get to this. There are brilliant things going on across the Federation, but bringing stuff collectively together to start to get those to scale is a different kind of a thing. So I can see some of them were in the chat. We worked with the wonderful Outlandish. We were starting to think we needed to put together some kind of data infrastructure. And we're like, right, we need to find someone who can help us develop a kind of brief for what kind of data infrastructure we want. They were brilliant because they came in and went, you don't actually need that right now. What you need is some kind of cultural roadmap so that a data infrastructure is useful for you. And we're like, Yeah, that is better. That's why we need partners. So they came with us and have done a series of workshops with people across the Federation. And we kind of came down on like, what's our vision here? What's our vision of what we're trying to do in terms of a data roadmap? And this is what we came up with. There were lots of workshops. It's probably still not perfect. It's never going to be. We're trying to collectively come up with something, but we wanted to have a positive impact on people and nature. We want a digital culture, which is come before, but also clarify and demonstrate the potential of data and how rewarding and useful it is. Great. That actually is worth taking time in terms of why were we trying to do this in the first place and making sure we agree. This is now something we can kind of go, yeah, that pretty much makes sense. That's what we want to do. And we had a whole lot of discussions. I've taken these some of the slides that they produced around what we actually wanted from that. So you'll see on here, doesn't say spec for data infrastructure. What we were looking at is do some piloting around building some tools that use data and highlight the benefits of it. Have documentation. It's not necessarily the most exciting thing, but it is the most critical. Data standards, data processes, making sure that we have the guidance that underpins what's being created so we're consistent enough to be able to use that data in practice. A clear development roadmap. So we do need a roadmap for where we're going to get to, but it has to be based on some of those other things. We have to also work out where our data is. And also have a data culture. Here you can see identifying the pain points. So we're kind of looking at the opportunities and the pain points and do some comms around it. Find some case studies. Where is data working so that we can start to give it a bit more prominence in the conversations we're having. So I've just used this once again for one of their slides of what we were discussing with them as their approach that was going to help us. So things that can quickly deliver value, involving stakeholders to test and understand requirements, getting some prototypes up, getting some feedback on those prototypes, and then iterating, testing and learning and do it again. So first thing we looked at was something we knew we were going to need, which is the very excitingly named infrastructure app. We manage a lot of reserves. We have more reserves than there are McDonald's in the UK. So if you think about that, that's a lot of stuff. I think we have more than there are Pretz in the UK also. Greggs is beating us. I think we should try and take them on because really, wouldn't it be better to have more wildlife trust reserves than Greggs, as much as I love a pumpkin spice latte? Anyway, but basically, we manage a lot of reserves. It's really critical, but we don't have a consistent way of representing all of the different kind of objects on that reserve, like benches and I immediately can't think of anything else on a reserve. That was great. Like fences, things like that. So we needed to create something that would support reserve managers in actually identifying where they are and what kind of condition they're in, because that's a really key thing. We didn't previously have a really consistent way to do this. So one of the projects was to come up with that. This is not the most exciting slide, but it shows the kind of clear bits of data that we needed on each bit in order to come up with our first prototype, which was collectively made, which is our infrastructure app. And the infrastructure app is currently going through some iterations, but it's basically demonstrating the practical use of our data. So if we can collect this data consistently, if we can then find a real tangible use for it and then create something collectively together, it's the process that we were doing for that was the key thing, not the output. The output is also useful. It had to be something we actually wanted to use, but the process is really key. So this was one of our kind of early prototypes. It's still going through, the project is still happening, and we will be rolling it out. But that was a really helpful way of doing it rather than jumping straight to what's the big infrastructure question we need to answer. So the other one we looked at the same time, so there's a project going on with a partnership group of wildlife trusts called Evidence Emergency. Evidence Emergency is a highly useful project which picks up on the issues with predominantly species data, species and habitat data, but data generally across the kind of environmental sector, but specifically looking at some of the wildlife trust data of how, we have some issues with the amount of data that we have versus the skills that we have to do things with it versus what we're doing with it. So Evidence Emergency has been running for a couple of years, predominantly led by Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust, who have been doing a fantastic job of kind of pushing this up the agenda. They got an innovation grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund in order to take this forward into what was called the Explore phase, where they were going to explore some of the key issues around data, collectively working on what might some of the answers to this be. So I'm just showing an example here because it ties to the one I showed before of infrastructure, which is picking something else that's critical. So similarly, our reserve boundaries. We need to make sure that our reserve boundary information is consistent across our wildlife trust. We might want to share it with partners. We might want to share it with each other. We might want to use it for kind of inferring other data, such as what's the carbon footprint of it? What level of different habitats are in there? What length of rivers do we manage? Where do they meet other boundaries? Loads of reasons we might want to have that consistent data so we can have just one live data set. But there's an issue with that. This is the kind of, I'm doing the end first on this, which is they've worked out a really interesting kind of process map working together of what might happen. But one of the issues is we started with looking at what everyone was recording around their reserve boundaries, and you'd think, you know, it's the outline of the reserve. Yeah, we had 233 different unique fields about that, which is not great for getting consistency. But don't worry, we've got to consistency on some of this now, which is great. But once again, it's the process of getting to that that's been really key for us to work through. Evidence Medicine is also doing some work on innovation. I just want to flag this because this is where we can start to show some of the really exciting bits about what's coming through in terms of data, because they're also looking at what makes projects stick. And that's going to be quite important. So the work they've been doing with, I flagged earlier on the things that are kind of interesting innovations that are happening now is Nature Counts, which is a kind of species recording project. And well, it's more than that, species recording software that kind of records it nicely. I'm doing a horrible job. But basically what makes these innovations stick across the Federation is the key thing they're looking at. And that's going to be important for our future data journey of how do we get this stuff to work. And a lot of it was obviously finding out collaborative working, kind of highlighting things that have to be affordable and useful. We haven't got time to be kind of using hypothetical ideas. It has to be a really practical thing that responds to a user need within the wildlife trust that we're going to need. So they're also looking at, I mentioned earlier, the skills side, starting to look at what the skills needs around data are. Do we need some consistent kind of setting up of different kind of almost catalogues of where do you want to get to? What kind of skills level should we be aiming for across the Federation? All of this to support our kind of wider data ambitions. What skills do we need in-house? How do we get them? How do we reach this point? So just to say, technical solutions are the easy bit. We did come up with a roadmap with Outlandish as well about our kind of technical aspirations. That is not the bit that's the problem. The bit that we need to solve and that we're working really hard to solve is getting those processes right that help us develop the answers, help us develop those standards, help us develop the kind of data models that we're going to need in the future, rather than trying to jump that bit and move straight to, okay, but how do we get a shiny dashboard out of the end? That's also not easy. It's just the easier bit of what we're trying to do. So this is where I'm kind of saying we're not there yet, but this is the journey that we're going on. And just to kind of say, what next? We are also looking now to build what's called the data facility. There is a job being advertised right now. I don't know when this goes on YouTube if you see it, but there is a job being advertised for a data analyst to come and work at the wildlife trusts to help us build a data facility, which kind of brings together the outputs of this work. We're going to be looking to prototype, pilot, try little bits of it, give it a go, small iterative approach. We'd love to hear from you if you want to apply for that. And that's where we're going next with our data journey. But there's so much we are learning from working with people like Ian. So I'm really happy to hear from him about OneGeology, because that's been a real inspiration for what we've been doing. So that's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand to Ian.
Just to quickly introduce Ian beforehand, when Alice and I were first talking about this event, Alice mentioned, you mentioned how much having a trustee is so important in helping you and guiding you in doing this work. So, so we're really lucky to be joined by that trustee that Alice was talking about, Ian. Ian Jackson has worked for the British Geological Survey initially as a field geologist. He became Director of Information and retired from the British Geological Survey as Operations Director in 2012. His expertise is in geoscience, environmental information strategy, development and delivery, corporate digital transformation, development and implementation of spatial data architectures and infrastructures. In 2012, he received the Distinguished Service Award for the UK Geological Society for services to national and international geoscience informatics and the Outstanding Contributions in Geoinformatics Award from the Geological Society of America in 2014. He now lives in Northumberland and is a trustee of the Northumberland Wildlife Trust and is the author of several books as well. And he will be sharing not just the amazing work of the Wildlife Trusts, but also his own project, which he developed, which is OneGeology. And I'll pass over to Ian on that point.
Thank you. Could somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen okay? Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm probably as long in the tooth as the project I'm going to talk about. And when I thought about it, some of this is going back 30 years. And the youngest bit is about 13 years ago. So in the digital era, which moves fast, I guess it's reasonable for you to ask the question, is there anything that's still going to be relevant or to resonate for you? So what a rock's got to do with anything you do or anything a wildlife trust does, for example? I hope I can show that there is some connectivity and relevance. So in the next 20 minutes, answering the questions of why bother sorting data out at all, talk a little bit about this project, OneGeology, and then pose some questions. Are there any lessons that the Wildlife Trusts or you can learn from what we did all that time ago? I believe they are, otherwise I wouldn't have joined Alice's advisory group, and she wouldn't have put up with me so long if she didn't think there were. So let's see. I'm really calling this Liberating Rocks initially because I work for a scientific organization, the Geological Survey. And sad to say that at the end of the 20th century, we were still using methods that you would have seen in the Victorian era. And we knew we had to change. And in order to change, we had to change some basic things like talk the same language about stuff. We couldn't possibly, as a national organization, have different systems and different maps and different data. And we didn't just want to work in the office digitally, we wanted to work out in the field digitally as well. And back in the early 2000s, the web was a new thing and maps on the webs was very new. And we wanted to be able to share data with others who needed it, for instance, radon gas cancer risk, or to put things on these new smartphones that were appearing, and to work in 3 and 4D, because geology is a 4D science, and to do 3D and 4D virtual reality. 20 years ago, this was frontiers. And we wanted to communicate better, and we couldn't do that without great data either. And we realized we just confused people because we were constantly talking in jargon, so we needed to deal with that. So with that pretty rapid, why are you doing this anyway? Let me switch from British Geological Survey in the UK to OneGeology. What is it? Well, we spent pretty much 15 years and a seriously large amount of money putting our own house in order. If I tell you that was 11 million pounds per year back then, you realize the order of magnitude it took to take an 800-person organization with a history of data going back 175 years to get that sorted was a big investment. But we did it. And in 2007, we decided to be a bit less selfish and aspired to help a lot of other people around the world move forward as well, together with some great partners. And the objective, because geology doesn't stop at political boundaries, was to get the basics of good data management and delivery in place globally. And our main objective was to improve the accessibility of that data, to be able to exchange the know-how and skills globally so that all nations could go digital and share. To do that, we had to implement standards and introduce consistency that just wasn't there, not even nationally, but certainly not internationally. And then we wanted to use the profile that we'd gained to increase the awareness of the relevance of geology. So in case you think this has got nothing to do with you, well, every time one of you buys and sells property, you pay BGS £2.60 for the part of the environmental report that goes into your conveyancing, because that's the provision of all the hazards, the geological hazards, from radon risk to flooding to subsidence, that this data underpins. So OneGeology, what it's about? Well, the topic was rocks, and it's a part of the environment, it's spatial. We were 120 organizations across, some of them federal in Germany and the States and Canada, all had their own jurisdictions, all had their own priorities, all had their own culture. And unlike us, well, most of us, because I live in the far north, they all had different languages. Just like the Wildlife Trust, and I guess all of your organizations, they're full of intelligent, passionate, resourceful people who know their domain. But the more intelligent they are, the more independent and idiosyncratic they are. So with all the virtues come vices. Mostly at that time, the resources given to data were devoted to data were inadequate. It wasn't regarded very highly as an important thing to do. You've kind of swapped that problem in 30 years. Most of your senior management actually think you ought to be able to do it now. What's stopping you? At the time, the question for us was, why do we go digital? We don't understand what we need digital data for. So leadership support was variable. Maybe that's still there. We kept it small and tight, a very small leadership group, a steering group, and a broad project base. Our skills were diverse and not necessarily as well spread as we wanted. And like everything in data, time and budget were inadequate. So there's the similarities with the Wildlife Trust, and I kind of leave it to you to see how many of those things resonate with you too. This is what Alice and I and the other people on her advisory group felt were common ground. What did we do? Well, we kept it short and simple. With 120 nations to deal with and all those languages and all those different jurisdictions and bodies, we could not afford a complicated project. So what did we want to do? What data did we actually have? We wanted to make that data available. We wanted to make that data shareable. We wanted to help people get it out there. But you notice that word doesn't say transferred, it says exchange, because this is a two-way process. And we wanted, naturally you might think, to increase the profile of geology and data management too, because it was pretty much the Cinderella at the time. Everybody wanted to spend money on the science, and not many people wanted to spend money on the data. If we put that another way, we wanted those project members to actually conduct data audits and reveal the hidden data assets, because there was an awful lot of rubbish talked about how much data they'd got and how much was digital. And we knew the reality was a lot less than the boast that they were coming out with. Just imagine Russia and China telling you that their data management was awful, and that's not going to happen. So we had to do that in a subtle way. We wanted to make their data visible and accessible. Yet again, security concerns came in. Not everybody wants to disclose their data. We couldn't talk about interoperability, even if I could say it, because most people didn't know what that term meant. Most people today don't know what that term meant, but it means having things all nice and cozy so you can share the data and have some consistency in the science behind it. We wanted to see what skills there were and how we could help each other. And this is a point I'm going to keep coming back to. We wanted to externally market the project really vigorously, because the bigger the profile we got, the more we would push those people who were doubters, and especially in senior management. The higher the project profile was, the more that people would want to join it. So, cutting through all of the hard work that happened, within 2 years, we had a portal serving data from across the world. It was a profound success. And not only in geology, but in the whole of the environmental spatial data domain. In other words, we had an awful lot of people doing an awful lot of work spread across the globe to achieve this. And this web portal was harvesting data from 120 countries. And as a result of that, the EC was so impressed that they gave us another 3 million euros to create a more detailed version for Europe. And of course, all the advances we made in delivering that for Europe, we then fed back to the rest of the world. So there was an immediate payback. Those are the flags of all the nations and all of the personnel that were involved in it. And there are many hundreds. And no, it didn't have a budget. No, there was no single budget. We scraped. Skunk works, it's called in Oz. We did it all under the counter. without any formal budget in any organization. Did it deliver? Well, it certainly revealed the enormous amount of data that we had and turned that data from being a liability that everybody thought, do we really have to keep all these filing cabinets and all these cores and all these maps into something that they would be able to use and leverage and make sweat as an asset? We put a lot of data out there on the world that people didn't know existed. We ran seminars and workshops. We helped each other and we initiated partnerships and funded projects. We managed, because people didn't realize initially why there was a need for this standardization of taxonomies and data systems. We managed to show that unless we all called a rock the same thing, we weren't going to get very far. And that we did by trial and error. And we raised the profile of geology and why it was important and why the management of the data that goes in it was important. Those are just some of the headlines that we got when we launched the portal. We had 98 million visitors in 24 hours to our website across the world. Why? Well, we had a focused project, a theme that everybody could join up to. We chose a geological map. Can you make your geological map of your country available? And then all of the data that went into that geological map followed. The vision was really short. The objectives were only 5. We didn't have a very complicated plan. It was simple. We didn't reject anybody. Everybody was welcome to participate, from the very well-developed, or so they thought, to the very underdeveloped, or so they thought. But that wasn't always the case when things turned out. We didn't intrude into local systems. They could keep whatever their national or federal systems were. We just wanted them to serve data, for us to harvest data in the international standards that we'd all agreed to. And we took a completely pragmatic approach to coordination in governments. Those who were prepared to lead and gave the time and had the effort in it or showed the initiative, they rose to the top. And we had elite people at the front, and we had people who were slower behind, but nobody got left behind. And we shared in a way that was incredibly candid and overcame an awful lot of the secrecy and shyness and reluctance to admit to failings at the beginning. And we didn't have a massive plan, because we did it by trial and error, because we knew that even 5-year plans are usually overtaken by events. So let's just see what we can do. Try it. Does it work? No, it didn't. Let's try it again. Let's not plan too much. We had a buddy system, so we helped each other, both bilaterally and multilaterally. We put an incredible amount of effort into outreach and media profile, because we knew that the higher the profile this project got, the less likely some of the CEOs and senior managers were like to pull the plug on their own national effort. I could tell you stories about how we got the US to join this late, but then came in and helped. We had an existing network. You know, geologists they're all nerdy. They all love each other. They all like drinking beer, and they all share kind of the same common threads. So we had that network and a language of scientists, but we had a small number of people who were prepared to drive it forward, and for whom it became an obsession, really. And then, because we were working in other people's second language, we had to have incredibly plain language objectives so that management and the world could easily relate to what we did. The lessons: there are no technical problems anymore. We could have said that 30 years ago, 15 years ago. None of what you want to do in data has a technical hurdle that you can't overcome. Almost all of the problems are social, political. So it's great to see that, as Alice said, that you're working on the cultural issues and the sociological issues in organizations, not data infrastructures. We sometimes felt, even though we slimmed down, our governance structures were inefficient, but that's just people for you. We had a lot of miscommunications, as you might expect, and I shouldn't think that just because we worked internationally that we had a monopoly on that. I think miscommunication happens all the time, even if we're all supposed to speak English. We still struggle. I say we, I'm no longer part of it, but going beyond the development into true day-to-day transactional operation is something nobody thinks about. So the money doesn't stop being spent once you're on the implementation phase. It goes on and on and on. And you may as well tell your manager, CEO that you're not going to stop begging for money, because you're going to continue to need money a long time. Sustaining it and the resources, same point. Justifying the benefits to a team of independent organizations who are working on their own priorities that change, whether it's a volcano going off in Iceland or mudslides in Chile, and they want to spend their time and effort on that. They've got real priorities, and we just have to bend with it and try and do our best. But at least we convinced them why data was important. The impact, well, it delivered. It had a positive influence on organizations' data management that was actually sustainable. Nobody wound the clock back on that. Geological surveys across the world moved forward. And in fact, geology was so good at what it did because of OneGeology, we became the example that was quoted in when the European Union decided to implement a directive for environmental spatial data. So they looked to us as a test bed for their protocols for everything from veterinary science to honey. What we did for rocks, people followed in other things. What's the lessons? Well, if you don't manage your data, you won't get very far in a digital era. It's essential. It's not a desirable. It benefits both the components of an organization and the whole entity. And the benefits go well beyond data. They're the glue that makes an organization stick together. Often you'll hear CEOs or ops directors talking about wanting to work together corporately. But what is it pragmatically they want you to do corporately? Well, data is the glue that sticks an organization together, regardless of what that data is. And you don't need large amounts of cash. You need a good plan, and then you need your skills. As Alice said, and I've repeated, don't blame the tools and hardware anymore. They're no longer an issue. I think the truth is that if you make the step change in managing your data, then your ambitions become possible. But for wildlife trusts, which is because I'm a trustee of one of them in Northumberland, if we don't do this, then we will struggle to demonstrate any progress. Can you imagine having a nature recovery strategy and not knowing what your base data for your nature is now? How do you measure what you will do in the future? So these are not data, this is just reality of management. The people you have to persuade in your own organizations, especially senior management, are time poor. They don't understand it, it's not their area. When you speak to them, think you're in an elevator going up 6 floors and keep it brief. If you communicate your plans, don't do it in techie text language. Communicate them in simple words. Choose something that you can, in your domain, that you can have a quick win, and something that everybody can join in with. Something you can do to actually show tangibly that why data management is a good idea. Don't forget that a picture tells 1,000 words. So if you haven't got maps, use graphics. But most people get pretty bored with text. And keep it short and simple. Nobody's an expert like you, nor are they as interested as you are. People who don't love a particular subject, like small plates, they're not trenchermen. They don't want it all at once, just like us data people do. And here's a bit of Geordie for you. Shy Ben's getting out. So if you're going to do a project, make sure you spend a lot of time posting about it, asking the questions, and keeping its profile high. And I think, Nish, that's it. I must admit, I'm a stranger to talking at my own screen. I'm usually standing up talking to faces. So yeah, I'll try and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ian and Alice. What what a rich amount of information. I think I'll definitely be going over the slides again because so much to learn. Thank you so much.